Now, Rutgers is a wonderful place. It's a great place for women. And I happened to arrive just as women's studies was taking off. And I rode when Rutgers College was still all male. The last year it was all male. And the next year women came. And one of my students was the editor of the Targum, not that year, but 2 years later. And she wrote an article for the Rutgers magazine on what it was like to be a woman coming here as the first class of women. It wasn't pretty, because they made very little effort to plan for women at Rutgers College. There'd been a lot of resistance from alums, and she remembers the ugly things that would be scribbled on doors and things. And she wrote this in the Rutgers magazine a couple of years ago. There were not happy people when they read it. But she wrote me and said that I think she'd done the wrong thing. She did exactly the right thing to remind people that, yeah, she's a big Rutgers alum, but she knows exactly what went on here. Oh, they debated it for 100 years, so to speak. I mean, they were determined way before, when Douglass was founded, because Rutgers College said, no, we don't want women. And of course, it was even, I don't know how strongly church affiliated, but Rutgers was private until very late. And what was odd about it, we were much state funded, but we still had a private status, whereas the agricultural school, now calls Environmental and Biological Sciences, but called Cook College for 100 years, it was founded by the Land-Grant Act and the Norrell Act, and it was always state funded. And Douglass became a state-affiliated college much before Rutgers College did. The coeducation debate was started in the early 1900s when the desire for women's colleges was becoming more and more voiced by women, along with the suffrage movement. I'll tell you a funny story about that. Actually, the effort to set up what became Douglass College, New Jersey College for Women, was run by Mabel Douglass, and the New Jersey Federation of Women's Clubs all banded together, gave dollars every so often and all that. But one of the things that Douglass urged the people supporting this was, please don't link this to the suffrage movement, because it will take a chance of dooming it. And of course, there were votes in New Jersey, and before we had national suffrage for women and everybody, and indeed 56% against it, or something like that. I don't remember the exact figures. So what you're dealing with here is a debate about why women should be educated, a fear of educated women. Ruth Bader Ginsburg once said, talking about Rutgers and women's colleges, that you get a sense that the world out there thinks the world is the universe of America is already a matriarchy, and men are about to be exiled. I mean, this is crazy, but the whole issue of what women should read, how women should perform, mostly directed, I should add, toward white middle-class women. But that's what brought the founding of Douglass, of New Jersey College for Women in 1918. Mary Hartman says, and I think absolutely right, that the next big thing was the push for coeducation at Rutgers College. Because Douglass had been founded, it rapidly began to, with the second or third year, it had 1,000 students. And then you turn to the 70s, and Douglass had been successful. And I should add that when I came here, Douglass was the strongest of the colleges in town, including in terms of the kind of students attracted here. It's the strongest students, et cetera. But the desire to turn Rutgers College into coeducational, and that had been brought up for a number of years. The dean supported it, the faculty supported the students, but the boards and the alums did not want it. So they kept turning it down, and finally they said, well, if we're going to have Rutgers College co-ed, Douglass has to be co-ed, so everybody's equal. And the dean at the time, I think Margery Foster, I'd have to check, but I think Margery Foster, the dean at the time said, no, we're not having any of this. A woman's college has a place here. And just as a little historical context, in the early 70s, there were probably 400 or more women's colleges in the country. Now, in 2016, there may be over 50, but not many. So the moving of coeducation to Rutgers College issued problems for Douglass, because historically, at the same time, was the women's movement. And the women's movement, paradoxically, wanted women to see that they were equal with men and they could do the same things and they didn't need apologies for gender and apologies for being born, biology, in other words. So women's colleges began to decline over the country because of this. And I think many of them had the same issues that Douglas encountered of, students, often the very best students, wanting a co-ed environment, didn't worry about. Radcliffe is gone now, as you know. Vassar became, I don't remember the date of Vassar, but Vassar is obviously a co-ed school and went many years ago. So the point is, the debates about women have so much to do with history. They have also so much to do, the history of women's work here has so much to do with Rutgers College going co-ed. What was amazing at Rutgers University, and particularly on the Douglas campus, because it had been called Douglas and the name changed to Douglas in '55, was Elaine Showalter. Before Mary Hartman, Elaine Showalter, a part-time lecturer, got people together to think about what a woman's college should be in the 1970s and thereafter. Secondly, she was determined, a whole group of women. She helped recruit other women like Mary Hartman in history. Elaine Showalter was also the founder of women's studies here. Wasn't a department then, it was a program. I would argue that Showalter and Mary Hartman were the central forces, and they were forces, behind the change of Rutgers, of Douglas, and of the whole university in New Brunswick at least, into a campus aware of women, interested in women's education. We had and have developed one of the best women's history programs in the country. We had a wonderful constituent of faculty in this English department that also did women's studies. And so what was interesting is that as women's colleges confronted challenges, women's studies programs and departments began to acquire mass and finally to become real departments, et cetera. Rutgers College was perceived as the male powerhouse. Now, about that time, I think I'm right about these figures, 27% of the faculty in New Brunswick were women. 45% of that number, 45% were at Douglas, of the women and even Douglas had 2/3 men in most departments. So you see what the issues were at the very highest levels of administration and at the most prestigious levels of academic rank, distinguished professor here, it's still dominated by men, though of course things have changed. And that's particularly true in the sciences. We have remarkable women at those highest levels, but saying you have remarkable women doesn't say you have anything like a mass of people. It's Deborah Gray White in history, Cheryl Wall in English. We have wonderful women who are always been at the top. Elaine Showalter, when she was still here, just Mary Ann DeKoven, who was a great feminist scholar at the outset of her career. We've had many, many wonderful women at those ranks, but they're thin compared. It's been much harder, I think, for women to be promoted to those ranks. When I became chair, this is an anecdote, but it's true, I looked at the salaries and realized that women hired at the same time, this was '89 when I became chair, that women hired in 1989, and before me, or during that whole period, not necessarily before me, I've been here forever, but that women were being paid less than men of the same cohorts and with the same levels of distinction. And I went to the dean, Richard McCormick, at the time. He later became president of Rutgers. And I said, this has to stop, and I want you to support me. I want to ask for out-of-cycle salary increases for all these women. I think there were 7. I can't remember now, but I think it was 7. And he agreed. Wow. But the number of deans who will decide rapidly without having 17 meetings, he looked at the evidence. I took it over there, and he thought, ooh. And he was also someone very aware of these issues. But it's a big issue, and those kind of discrepancies are not likely to happen now. People are more vigilant, but they used not to be, and it happened all the time. Douglas also had faculty of color before certainly Rutgers College. Livingston was founded with that desire to bring women of color, faculty of color, not just women, but Livingston was, but it didn't come till 1968, so it wasn't a part of these kind of battles. But the perception of all the campuses was that Rutgers College was the powerhouse. And that was where the men were, the men with great reputations, but also the men who ran things. And that made a difference. Douglas had really amazing people who were scholars, so did Livingston, but the people who ran things and ran the graduate programs, which graduate education wasn't a central thing in those days because the colleges were much more powerful. But Douglas was the big place. It had great students. Its rejection of the coeducational status saved that college for women. It remains now the only state college, state-supported university that has a college for women. And I think it's even stronger now than it was years ago, but that's not being simple. And the deans, Mary Hartman particularly, but later Carmen Embar, herself, an African-American woman and a lawyer, and tough, wonderful to work with and negotiate with sometimes. But Douglas has had many changes, but the changes, it seems to me, are for the most part about redefining women's education for new generations who don't need women's colleges in the way women did in 1918 when there were no other options. What Douglas has done, I mean, when women's studies came, it obviously began to think, okay, we have to think about what do we want women to do? Now, a previous dean over there had urged women not to go into education, which had been a traditional field for women, but to go into business and industry, in other words, to prepare themselves to be executives, not school teachers, because that was defining women the way they had always been defined. And I think that was a remarkable stance. I think that was in the 1950s. I'm less certain about the dates. But with the coming of Elaine Showalter and all the women who formed the women's history groups and formed the group over at Douglas, people began to say, so how do we want to think about women now? And so it ended up, particularly when Mary Hartman became dean, it ended up with and she became dean around 82, I think. It ended up with people saying, we can't just think women go into humanities or soft social sciences. We've got to think about women in the sciences, what's now called the STEM fields. And they developed Douglas programs for women. They took a dorm and turned it into the Bunting Cobb dorm that had 10 graduate students on floors for women as advisors, role models, counselors. It was a remarkable transformation of a college, seeing that a university, they wanted to be sure that women had the same opportunities as men, but they also wanted to be sure that women had the kind of, women were still, and frankly still are, dissuaded often of going into sciences. And so they worked really hard on that. Now we have an engineering dorm over on the Bush campus. The college was against that in those days. I think probably myself wrongly, but they felt that this would, it would simply get women to think of themselves not as Douglas women. But whatever, the constant movement into science, into thinking about the myriad of professions available to women that were not available in the 50s or 60s, where educated women were, one, mostly middle class, and two, educated women became school teachers or something. Library. Yes, exactly. The movement of African Americans and in women in higher education have many similarities and obviously differences too, but it's very important. Douglas, for instance, as you probably know, had the first woman who came here when they discovered she was black. She was told she couldn't live on campus. The next two women came, I think, in the 50s, graduated around 1950. Evelyn Field was one of them. I don't remember the other one's name. And, they were real path breakers because they lived on campus and they became powerhouses on the campus as well. Evelyn Field, she died just recently, but she was an amazing figure. And part of it was she walked onto campus with the assumption that she was equal to any white woman. And that can't be simple in 1950 because Rutgers has always been a place, even now, a good 33%, I think, of our students are first-generation college. It was obviously higher in those days, but you still had, you can say, well, this is the North. Our students don't tend to think there was racism in the North. They don't even know that New Jersey had slavery. I mean, just because we're in the North doesn't mean you don't have slavery. And so people have really set out to educate people about a lot of our history as well, which is healthy. But for women, Douglas' real evolution, I think, came in constant, not incremental, but new programs, new ideas about what women needed to know to be successful, and yes, to be competitive in the workplace and in the civic space. And both are equally important. That's why Douglas is so good about women's leadership programs. It was called the Transformation of Undergraduate Education. Dick McCormick came back here, and just a little background. In 1980, the faculties of each college were taken out of the colleges and moved into one department. So all of history went one place, all of English. There were 5 English departments in New Brunswick in those days. There were 3 or 4 German departments. It was crazy. But they moved the faculties into one, which is really the foundation of Rutgers becoming an AAU school, because it concentrated people and their interest. But it also left the colleges looking curiously close to being student life centers. There were efforts to have faculty fellows and things. These were not successful. Douglas Barry Hartman had supported that, as all of us did, because it was clear the university was going to move into a Berkeley or Michigan kind of model.
I don't know what that means.
Oh, it means a model of a big statewide university, where we had once been a system of 4 or 5 federated colleges in New Brunswick and then Newark and Camden. So federated colleges that each had their own power. What was left in 1980, the colleges still remained in control of admissions, the graduation standards for each college, even what defined cheating were different on each campus. The whole thing was just chaos, particularly when you had not the small student environment that you had in the 60s, but you had 30,000 or more students in New Brunswick, undergraduates. So McCormick, who had been a dean here, who grew up here, his father was a major historian and the historian of Rutgers later. His mother was head of scheduling. He knew more about Rutgers than almost any human being could have who became president. And one of the things he asked immediately was, how much is undergraduate education a part of the new research-oriented Rutgers? And he appointed this task force to ask the questions. Initially, he said, now remember, there are third rail issues, probably not his term. One of them is Douglas, because if you try to fiddle around with Douglas, you will get angry alums, and it will undermine what you're doing. And the same is true if you fiddle around with Cook College. So, Michael Beals and Linda Samad, who were head of the subcommittee, the structure committee of the task force, they came to see me, and then we went to see the president and said, you can't talk about undergraduate education without talking about Douglas. McCormick said, do it. So we worked. The report that came had a lot to do with Carmen Ambar. She rightly said Douglas isn't defended in this report, and don't pretend it is.
Who was Carmen?
Carmen Ambar was the dean of Douglas College at the time. Now, there was a huge outbreak of people to Save Douglas campaign. Some of it I thought unfair. I felt we were really going to do that, but I thought I didn't blame people. I just found it sometimes painful. So Carmen Ambar was the dean, and she was a force, and a wonderful force here, really amazing dean. She was talking to me one day about how we should, what kind of recommendations to ensure Douglas. And she looked at me and she said, I shouldn't be talking to you. I should be working this out with the president. So off she went. And she did it. And it was wonderful, because what she was asking actually was, what kind of guarantees are we getting that Douglas is a unit that is still serving women? Now, early on, Douglas had started programs like every Douglas woman took a course called Shaping a Life. But we did more and more of that. I mean, Carmen left not too long to go to Cedar Crest, But she and Dick McCormick had really, I think, set a force in motion that led to what we have now. Douglas had real problems with recruitment for years. They had numbers, but a lot of the people were, each college had its own admissions, but frankly, a lot of students were being put on various campuses to fill beds. And I remember when we had our first class, so the first admission say we did was everybody was admitted to New Brunswick, and then they chose if they wanted to choose Douglas. The women went to Douglas if they chose that. And suddenly we had women choosing Douglas. I have to say, the first year I thought if we could just get 250, I'll be happy. Well, we got 450. Now we have 750 and they're bursting at the seams. But the point was, we were getting women whose mothers, whose environment told them what they wanted to know about a woman's college, of what a residential college had to offer. They take courses everywhere, but they've been doing that since 1980. They take courses everywhere, but now they also were choosing a college with special programs for women and with a lot of advising. That's one of the advantages of a residential college. So I think the thing worked out really well. I think most people, including the most angry alums, would agree that the Douglas now is as strong as it's ever, stronger probably than it has been since around 1969-70. The students are great. It's also one of the most diverse of our groups. About 27% are African American women, 24-something Latino women, and Asian and other groups after that. The point is, over 50% are non-traditional European white. And I think that also indicates the appeal of this college experience. Now, sometimes it's about people who don't want, families who don't want their daughters in a co-ed environment. Well, Rutgers is a co-ed place, no matter what. But I think it's also a testimony to the kind of special programs, the special funding that's available at Douglas. We've done a good job. I mean, we being the people who run Douglas on a day-to-day basis, the deans, and also the Institute for Women's Leadership, the people who've really cared about women's education here. Well, one of the things that Mary was doing in her last year as dean, she became dean in '82, and I don't remember exactly the year she stepped down, but she began more and more to focus on women's leadership. She focused on the sciences with one of those wonderful programs, but she also began to focus on women's leadership. And the focus on women's leadership led her, rightly, of course, to think about, well, we can't just talk about it. What does it mean to say, oh, we're producing women leaders, let's do something about it? And she felt very strongly that leadership involved social activism. It involved a consciousness of justice and injustice in the world we live in, and not just gender injustice or injustice based on biology. So she said she wanted to. They started a program of Institute of Leadership Scholars, and at the same time she was developing the Institute for Women's Leadership, which became a consortium that put all of the women's many wonderful programs and institutes for women together, like Douglas Residential College now, the Institute for Research on Women, the Institute for American Women in Politics, the Institute for Women and Global Issues. I can't remember all the names, but there are a lot of women in the arts. There are 8 or 9 of them, and they have been a wonderful force here. The IWL it's what brings them all together, but it's been a wonderful force, I think, to keep people here focused and outside the university focused on how much here goes on that is called what I call thinking about women in society, in culture, in history, etc. I've been on the Leadership Scholars Board for a long time, and I always go, except for this year, I always have gone to their talks in the spring that the young women give, etc. I mean, I became identified with interest in women's issues, which was a serious interest, by the way, and always has been. Certainly, I trace it back to my mother, who was born in 1906 and was a farm woman, and who said to me when I was 4 or 5, you should be glad you're male. You'll have freedom that I never had. And I've never forgotten that. It's tough, but it stayed with me all my life. My mother was a great lady, a farm woman, but a wonderful, ravenous reader, wonderful lady. very funny and tough. But that, I'm sure, was what possessed, or at least informed, provoked, made it impossible not to care about women's issues when I got to campus. Plus,
Were you from New Jersey?
no, I was born in Appalachia in the Kentucky coal fields, and then grew up in Central Florida when we went about 10. But you know, I happened to very fortuitously end up coming to Rutgers in '71 when women's issues were coming to the front. Elaine Showalter's book called A Literature of Their Own, British Women Novelists from Bronte to Lessing, was my second PhD. That is to say, I'd had a very traditional education where the only women writers you ever talked about were George Eliot and Emily Dickinson. And Elaine Showalter's book, shall we say, opened my eyes that I didn't live in an all-male world. It was a brilliant, it remains a brilliant book. It's in print after all these years. But what it did was to make you rethink your education, to rethink the way you learn to think about novels or poetry, the writing about women, but also the writing by women in a society and culture. Now, I only do Britain. I've never had enough interest or knowledge of American literature, but in fact, it got me really to think a lot. And so that, plus my background with my mother, et cetera, I think it was so exciting to be at a part of Rutgers. And when I became a dean, it was not me who's the leader. Women wanted to form a department, and they also wanted a PhD program. And I happened to be in the right place to help. And there was no way I could not help. We happened to have a president, Mason Gross, and I didn't come till '71, but I knew this. I didn't know Rutgers was a public school, but I knew enough about Mason Gross. He was also a TV personality. But Rutgers, he really sympathized and agreed with the students in their protest. So rather than having the campus turn into just a horrible, shouting, mean place, he invited them into his office. There were still protests. There was Newark, particularly the takeover of Conklin Hall by black students. And these were moments, these were absolutely sort of, quote, revolutionary moments, not in the way we would use revolution in the streets, but it was that. It really made people focus. It shocked people. It also made you think, so really, are we working in a university that's complicit with racism, that's complicit with sexism? So 69, 70, the Vietnam protests, the rising of the black protest, black power movement, which has some connection now with Black Lives Matter. I mean, to be frank, students, black students particularly, but also other students, gay and lesbians, were much more vocal politically in the 70s than they tend to be now. I missed the protest. I can remember students getting in fistfights in class, haven't helped me. But the point was, people, these things really mattered, and they mattered to a general population. Part of it was there was a draft, so Americans went to war, not just people who sign up, and not just people we don't know, but people in all communities, et cetera. So it was a fascinating period. It was a period of high political consciousness, and students were highly political conscious in ways, even with increased communications of technology, I don't think they are now. I don't think it's not that they're unconscious. I think that they're probably disinterested. I don't know. I think I don't think students are any less smart, indeed smarter now than they were when I came here, but I think there's so many pressures on students' attention, not only because of technology, but also because of the environment that has put so much pressure on, will I find a job? And sometimes politics, or at least political activism, can seem undermining that career efforts. So it's a complicated issue that I obviously am not qualified to explain in a way people could, but it's a concern of mine, particularly when you see a politics in this country that is divisive, ugly, mean, and doesn't seem to care whether people are involved or not. It says it does, but you can't see it. I mean, Obama's comment at our graduation that, so you're going to build walls all around us and never know the rest of the world? Impossible. And he was so right to bring that up, because you can't think that you don't live as a part of a larger world any more than you think being on a campus isolates you from the larger world. Rutgers is a campus that doesn't look like Princeton or Harvard. That is to say, its architecture looks more like the world around it, even with all the greenery here. But there's no effort to make it an Ivy League enclave separated from the rest of the world. I don't think that's true anymore of Princeton or Harvard either. But in other words, even the architecture is it suggests a different kind of possible experience. Well, when you ask about the issue of what makes Douglass not a student life center, which is what I worried about when we changed things in 1981, where the faculty were withdrawn, I think it's been the energy of the deans and the faculty who care. It's been interested in all those centers who form the consortium of Women's Institute for Women's Leadership. There's a lot of energy about how young women are educated, and it centers over there at Douglass, on the Douglass campus itself. It's also the fact that they have a course now called Knowledge and Power. It was once called Shaping a Life, where all women who come to Douglass in their first year take this course. And I think it builds, if not an agenda, a bond of common language that people share. It builds a sense of common concepts that involve the role of women in contemporary society, the way knowledge is shaped and constructed, the way power comes out of that, and where women fit into that construction. And I think that's been one of the things that has given Douglass much more than being a student life thing. All campuses in America, at least, are student life centers in some ways, but Douglass has great advising, much stronger, not necessarily better, but the regular system has many more students to look after than you would at Douglass, because they've got really focused on the women over there. Very important role. I mean, the AADC, the Associate Alumni of Douglass College, they are really very active in building interest in being alumni almost from the day people are first-year students. And I know we're always actually interested in building donors and all of this too, but in fact, Douglass, I think, is remarkably successful in generating a lifelong commitment to the issues that constituted Douglass College or Douglass Residential College. I think that many women who come here, they stay on campus for 2 years or 1 year, and then they move off campus. I think Douglass, because of that course, but also because of Douglass having enough women in its leadership programs, its science programs, it gives you a kind of a network of organic filaments, if you will, that connect each other, but also touches other people, other women from Douglass who are not as involved in those kind of programs. So I think that, when you graduate, you feel some nostalgia already for your school and what it meant. But I also think that Douglass has been very successful in making people understand how those programs have shaped their lives. University education shaped everybody's life, let's be honest. And, I certainly know how mine was totally changed, since I certainly wouldn't have expected to be at a university. But
did you start out thinking you were?
I was going to be a high school English teacher.
Really?
Yeah, and I had a wonderful advisor in college who said, "You should go to graduate school." And I said, "I'm not sure what graduate schools do," which I wasn't. And I'm here because of him. And I know that. It was I feel being a mentor and advisor is probably more important in some ways than the classroom on a campus, because it does shape lives. People need the kind of guidance, particularly in a university this size with the resources we have. If you can plug students into those resources, you've really done a lot. You've already given them pathways, and I think that's very important. And if you can plug women into the pathways that Douglass offers, you really have made a difference, because young women are smart, often they would probably say, "I'm not interested in feminism. Good Lord, we don't need that." Something my mother did, or her mother. But in fact, those issues haven't been solved or resolved. And I think once you begin to live in an environment where those issues come up a lot, it gets into you no matter what you mean to think. I mean, I'm often sorry that not enough women will use the word feminism. It's become the F word. But I also realize that I'm an older person, and feminism was such a central issue for many women, and me too, for that matter, in 1970. And we've evolved a lot, though not as much as people like to think. It's not a generational issue. And it's not about bra burnings. It's about something much more essential about living your lives in a society. It's the Rutgers Foundation, the university-wide foundation, and the AADC, the alums.
The Douglas alums.
The Douglas alums have, for many years, I don't know a lot about it because obviously most of the comments about it have been embargoed. I mean, you don't hear much. But I can sort of define what I knew when I was still a vice president. I was vice president of undergraduate education. The issue became one of, did the alums report to the University Foundation? And did they raise money that went through the University Foundation? Or did they have total control over not only fundraising, but their fund listings, their fund lists, and all of this? There are other issues. I mean, I remember the engineering dean once saying, you know, we shouldn't be embargoed from asking our graduates for donations just because they were Douglas women. But they've been it for us a long time, and they've done a really great job. They've raised a lot of money for Douglas programs and Douglas scholarships and things. But I think it was an inevitable contest or conflict in the sense that they were the only, they were their own people. And then when Douglas became a university unit, they stayed independent until now. But that independence also has costs. It's often led them into real contests or conflicts with the deans at the time of Douglas College, which is very unfortunate because they have the same ambitions. But I think it's really about who finally reports to whom, how responsible they are to the university's foundation in general. They're the only alumni group that has been independent, and nobody gives up independence easily, but I think you also have to be, there has to be some give and take and all that. The response to the transformation report, Mary Hartman said, remember what was promised Radcliffe, and now it's an institute. So Douglas is the only women's focused residential college in the country, and it should be. I don't think it's going to go away. I think, if anything, we're going to need more dorms over on the campus because it is single-sex dorms. And one of the things that you do to make certain that you don't violate constitutional rights, you have to be sure you also offer men that opportunity to have single-sex housing. So far, I think there have been 10 men who've asked for it. There might have been 15, but not very many. And I have a former student, Christian Gannon, and I remember that she wrote me she'd already graduated when the transformation discussions started. She wrote me a wonderful thing about why she loved Douglas, and she'd gone there. She'd been a Douglas woman. And she said, remember, women's education, once it's taken for granted, is not going to be women's education. It's everybody's education, and it loses the edge of thinking about issues that have to matter to women if they're to maintain equality. And I've never forgotten that, obviously. She's an amazing woman, has a PhD from Hopkins and teaches at the National Cathedral School in Washington now. But what she was also talking about was the power of Douglas. And she said, you don't muck around with that without thinking about its cost. I think the IWL's main role is to help the groups work together. But IWL obviously runs the Leadership Institute for Undergraduate Women. But I think the IWL's role is mainly, I think its role is expanding, but I think it's mainly to try to be a center, a consortium. Alison Bernstein once said when she took the job that she didn't take the job to be just a member of an orchestra. She meant to be the conductor. Now that's a little harder than you think when you think about it, because you have very strong institutes led by very strong women leaders. May not all agree with that point of view, but the IWL has been very important. I don't think students are as aware of it, and maybe many faculty, as they are aware that its constituent members. I think that's true. I think it's also a wonderful place where women alums also get involved. The meeting you attended, you could hear alums on the phone, other people at the table were not faculty. I was, obviously, but not very. I'd have to think about who was around that table. But IWL has been wonderful in the ways that it works to keep alums engaged and engaged in the important issues. The Gloria Steinem Chair has been a remarkable kind of magnet for interest, and I've always remembered that, what is it that Gloria Steinem once said? It was only with the coming of the feminist movement that people realized that sexism used to be real life. and I think it may still be sometimes. I mean, I think Steinem said that a long time ago, that women had been living real life. She has no connection directly. She, of course, has been such a strong, Ms. Magazine. She's been such a strong voice for women for so many years. And the IWL people decided that they want, Allison particularly, and led the people, was the leader of this, that a chair devoted to media studies and women, named after Gloria Steinem, was one of the best, not only a magnet for what we were doing here, but also was a tribute to one of the central women leaders of the 20th and 21st centuries in women's issues. And I think that's been very, very important. Women's education in the future. Well, I'm not one of those people who think you've arrived at utopia when you don't notice race, or you've arrived at utopia when you don't notice women. Those are conditions by which people are erased, and I feel strongly about that. I can't laugh about that. I think the issue about the future of women's education, that's a very complex question. I think that the pressures of economics on higher education, the pressure of the social world we live in, which is so focused on professional education, not humanistic education, but professional education, so focused on the careers and all of that involved in that. I think those are the very worlds where you see women too often erased or having to get a toehold. Yes, we have wonderful women executives and wonderful women leaders. Hillary Clinton is a very good example. Elizabeth Warren, who also has some connection with Rutgers. But I think women's higher education around the country is going to be a smaller and smaller adjective for women, unless you have a place like Douglas Residential College and the Institutes for Women's Leadership with all those things, Institute for Women in Work. They keep asking tough questions and not letting negative answers stop them. I think we're always going to be living in you hear people say we live in a post-racial world, we live in a post-race world, poppycock. We live in a post-feminist world, post-women's world, whatever. This is nonsense. And I think the issue, though, is you're going to see women's focuses on women in higher education constantly diminishing, decreasing. But I think some schools will not allow it because of the presence and the power of the women they have here now. Now, some of this is dependent on hiring. If schools don't continue to hire, like our history program, #1 in women's history in the country, if they don't continue to hire the kind of women that have been trailblazers in women's history and have really made such a difference, and they still are, I should say, we won't have people on campus to press firmly. If we don't continue to hire strong people at Douglas College itself, is Douglas Residential College, its deans, but also strong people who work at the IWL. There were people who would have said Mary Hartman's irreplaceable, and Mary Hartman would say nobody is. But what's not replaceable, unless you're careful, is the kind of energy, imagination, and generosity of intelligence that come to making a difference on a campus. And that's not easy to replace, and it's not easy to give spokespeople who are going to be busy thinking about these issues.
What does Rutgers need to do? What do the men need to do?
Excuse me, that was an unfortunate remark. What do men need to do? Shut up. No. Men, actually, there are many men on this campus who, I'm old, but there are a lot of men for whom thinking about women's issues, working about women's issues are just second nature, as it is also true that about race issues, whether or not you're black or white. They did a lot, and they have done a lot to support the global missions of women here, Charlotte Bunch, the work of Douglas. They've done really good. I mean, it's thriving. But I think as soon as they begin to put priorities on, I think as soon as right now we have an emphasis on diversifying the administration and faculties, and that means obviously race, but it also means women in many fields. I think as soon as we say, oh, we've done that, been there, done that well, goodbye, that, when you lose your consciousness of what you're about on a larger level, you're going to have trouble. And I think that, so for me, Rutgers has been really great at the front of the group of colleges and universities, but you can never take it for granted or you won't have anything left.
You have to continue the conversation.
You have to continue the conversation, but you also have to continue to be willing to make appointments in areas where you're making a difference, where women, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a female to make a difference, but women are role models too. And young women, you learn, if you've taught as long as I have, 45 years, you're surprised, sometimes gratified, gratified certainly, but when people will tell you from 30 years back what a difference you've made in their lives in specific ways. Women particularly, about being given a sense that they were their own spokespeople, that they could articulate their ideas and they mattered as much as anyone in a class of 100. And, I don't know how much you think about that when you're up in front of 100, but I think we can't let ourselves become complacent that we did so well. Look at this, we have all these women's groups, we all do this, we do that. Those women groups have had to fight, and they've had to fight for staffing, they've had to fight for space, they've had to fight for being at the table. And at the table means part of decision makers. So that's a thing at every level, departments and larger areas.